There's a point that arrives for a lot of people where something slightly uncomfortable becomes hard to ignore. On paper, things are working. Financially, there is stability. In some cases, there's real success. Options exist now that didn't exist before, and you have figured out how to make money work for you, how to create it, how to manage it, how to scale it. And yet internally, there's still something that doesn't feel fully resolved. Not in an obvious crisis sense, not in a way that would necessarily make sense to anyone looking from the outside, but in a quieter way, a sense that you have solved one side of your life and not quite the other. And that can be very disorienting, because most of us are conditioned to assume that capability transfers, that if you can figure out one area of your life, you should be able to apply the same logic everywhere else. But the internal world doesn't really operate like that. And that's where things can start to get quite interesting, because you can be extremely effective externally and still find yourself repeating the same internal patterns, the same reactions, and still have the same emotional responses that you can't quite explain or don't fully feel in control of at times. And it creates this strange split between what you know and what actually happens in the moment. Now, most people try to solve that gap by thinking harder or understanding more or trying to become more self-aware. But the gap usually isn't informational, it's operational, meaning it's not about what you know, it's about what your system does automatically when it's under pressure. And that distinction is crucial, because your financial world is largely built in the space of planning, structure, and logic. But your internal world often operates through something much faster, much older, much more automatic. So you end up trying to solve something biological with a cognitive strategy. And that mismatch is where a lot of frustration sits, because you can understand yourself perfectly well and still react in ways that don't align with what you understand. Now, if we slow this down a little bit, what's actually happening is quite simple. Your nervous system is responding before thought fully enters the picture. It's scanning, interpreting, and reacting based on patterns it has learned over time, often long before you have a chance to consciously decide anything. And those patterns are not random at all. They're built through repetition, through past experiences, through what has felt safe before, through what has felt unsafe. So when you find yourself reacting in a certain way that doesn't match your level of awareness, it's not a contradiction. It's simply two different systems operating at different speeds. One is reflective, the other is automatic. And the automatic one usually wins in real time, which is why insight alone often doesn't change behaviour in the moment. It only changes interpretation after the fact. And that's where people start to feel stuck, because you can see everything clearly in hindsight, but not necessarily interrupt it as it's happening in real time. Now, here's where this becomes particularly relevant for high-performing individuals, because the same traits that build success externally tend to rely heavily on control, prediction, and mental organization. You learn to anticipate outcomes, you learn to reduce uncertainty, you learn to stay ahead of things. And that works extremely well in the external world. But internally, those same mechanisms don't always translate clearly, because your internal system isn't something you can fully predict or structure in the same way. It responds in real time, often emotionally, often somatically, often before thought catches up. So you end up with a kind of imbalance, a very capable external operator, and a relatively automatic internal system that hasn't been fully worked with at the same depth. And that gap is where a lot of tension sits, because you assume that more understanding should close it. But understanding alone doesn't reach the part of you that is actually running the response. Now, I want to be clear here. This isn't about something being wrong. It's actually about something being unintegrated, because your system has been optimized for performance, output, and external control, but not necessarily for internal regulation in the same deliberate way. So you can have a life that looks organized while still internally experiencing reactions that feel slightly out of sync with it. And that's often where the question emerges. I've figured out so much externally. Why does this still feel unsolved? And that question is very important, because it usually marks the point where external strategy stops being enough and internal structure starts to matter more. Not in a conceptual way, but in a lived physiological way. Now, this is where things often begin to shift for people, where they realize that the problem isn't more thinking, it's not more optimization, it's not more self-analysis. It's actually learning to recognize what the system is doing automatically and how little of that is actually under conscious control in real time. Because once you see that clearly, you stop trying to solve yourself like a business problem, and you start understanding that you're dealing with something much more fundamental, a system that was built through experience, not logic, and therefore doesn't update through logic either. Now, in the next video, I want to go deeper into something very specific, which is how high performance itself can start to behave like a loop, where ambition, identity, and validation become tied together in a way that's difficult to separate. And once that happens, it doesn't just affect success. It starts to affect how you experience yourself entirely. If you want a more detailed breakdown of how this pattern actually forms underneath awareness and how to start working with it at the level where it actually changes, click the link underneath this video. That's where I go deeper into this and explain how to work with the system directly rather than just trying to understand it.